Welcome, everybody. How is everyone enjoying the conference? Good? Got a thumbs up, couple thumbs up? Excellent. I'll try not to ruin it for you. All right, today we're going to talk about migration to Windows Azure SQL Database, what used to be called SQL Azure. So before we get started, this is going to assume that you are familiar with SQL Azure. I'm going to call it SQL Azure even though the name is Windows Azure SQL Database. Who here is familiar with SQL Azure? Most of you? All right, so I don't need to do a primer on what SQL Azure is? No? Good, okay, because that'll probably take most of the time. So we're going to talk about how to migrate. So anybody here have things in production in SQL Azure? Or just playing, yeah, a few of you? How was your migration experience? Okay. So I'm assuming the rest of you are here because you want to know, you've been playing with it. What SQL Azure, want to know how to get there, how to take your database to SQL Azure, correct? True statement? All right, good. So we're going to start, in this session, we're going to start simple and then go to probably advanced, all right? So things like, hey, how do I know if my database will go to SQL Azure? How do I get it ready to go to SQL Azure? Has anybody tried to take the AdventureWorks database to SQL Azure yet? No? I'm going to show you how to do that because it just craps all over itself when you try to do that. So we're going to show you how to do that, right? And it's a good example because it's if you've got something that's not supported, how do you get it ready? Things like that, right? So we're going to talk about that. So I am a technical evangelist for Microsoft. I'm out of Redmond. What I cover SQL Server, box product, and I cover all of our Azure data services. So SQL Azure storage and everything around those services, right? That's my blog, my email address, and my Twitter handle. If you guys want more information about what we're going to talk about or want to see other information, feel free to reach out to me. I don't like these long one page, I wrote this, I did this. Just that's all you need to know. Reach out to me, we can talk more. So what we're going to talk about today is some of the tools, utilities, approaches, best practices you can use to get your database from on-premises to Windows Azure SQL Database. How do you get around some of the errors? How do you get it ready for migration? And how do you migrate? Right? We'll talk about some of the best practices, what's supported, what's not supported, things like that. Okay. So DACFX. We'll talk about the DACFX. We'll talk about then the Windows Azure Import Export Service. We'll talk about the SQL Server data tools. This is a SQL Server conference, I know. But any .NET developers in here? And a few of you? All right, because we're going to crack open Visual Studio a couple times, right? Yeah, I know. Just like, yes, but this is from a migration standpoint, from a software development lifecycle perspective, this will be your best friend. Right, so we're not going to, we'll look at a little code, right? But for the most part, we'll try to stick to SQL, right? But we will crack open Visual Studio a few times, right? We will look at some of the other migration tools. Just hey, how do they work? What do they support? Things like that, and then we'll look at some of the best practices. So let's begin with the DACFX and the Import-Export service. All right. So before we begin, let's get some terminology out of the way. The DAC, who's familiar with, this is SQL people, right? Who's familiar with the DAC? Just a few of you, right? Data to your application, anybody done DAC packs and things like that? All right, so what's a DAC pack? The answer's right there, right? So we're talking the DAC, we're talking the DAC framework, right? This is what SQL Server Management Studio uses. It's installed with SQL Server. We'll talk about that. And then there's DAC packs, right? This DAC packs have been around, I think, since at least 2008, and if not, I think 2005, SQL Server 2005. In 2012, they upped the version of the DAC framework to 2, and they created what's now called a backpack. Awesome naming convention. Right? A backpack, right? It's the same artifact as a DAC pack, but it also includes data as well, okay? What's the difference between a DAC pack backpack and a .back file? Anybody know? You can't crack open a .back file, can you? Can't open it. But you can open up a DAC pack or a backpack and see what's in there, right? It's just essentially just a zip file, a compressed zip file. right? All the data is compressed and encrypted, but you can actually crack it open and see what's in this backpack file. The import-export service and SQL Server Management Studio use the DAC framework and DAC backpacks for migration. We'll show you how to do that. So, DAC framework. This is automatically installed. This is just a set of client libraries that's automatically installed with SQL Server. It's been installed with SQL Server since DAC first came out in 2005. So there is no need to install additional client libraries unless you're using previous versions of SQL Server, right? So if you're using SQL Server 2008 R2 and earlier, there may be, and we'll get to this, there may be the need to install additional client libraries, and I'll talk about that a little later, right? But if you're just using, and we'll talk about this, if you're just using SQL Server 2012, there's nothing else to install. It gets installed with SQL Server, right? And this is the client libraries that SQL Server Management Studio uses to create its DAC and backpacks, right? They just make it available for us as well to call those same client libraries. Okay, and we'll see an example of that. And all it is just, if you're familiar with DAC packs, these are just little artifacts. All it does is make the distribution of your databases much simpler. Its whole goal is to simplify your distribution of databases. So in the world of Windows Azure and Windows Azure SQL Database, this is what we can now use to migrate our on-premises database to SQL Azure, right? And very easily. Okay. So that's the DAC framework. That's on-prem, right? A set of client libraries installed with SQL Server. But then we have, on the flip side, we've got the import-export service. So there's two scenarios. We've got the scenario where we're talking about on-premises, right, our database, and we want to get that to Windows Azure SQL Database. But for those of you who have done and migrated to SQL Azure already, how do you back up? How do you back up a database? Or how do you get your database from SQL Azure back to on-premise? Anybody tried that? So this is what the import-export service is. It's the ability to take an on-premises database and import that into SQL Azure, or backup, we'll call it backup, or export your database from SQL Azure to on-premises, right? Simple as that, right? So you can go from SQL Azure to SQL Azure, migrate from SQL Azure to on-prem, vice versa, right? This is the server side, the cloud side of the migration process, right? And we'll see that in action as well, okay? And it uses backup, or the backpack. But let's talk architecture for a second, right? This is as simple as it gets. It really doesn't get that much harder, right? You've got your on-premises database, your SQL Server, and everything talks backpack, right? You can't do a DAC pack, it talks backpack, right? So it's the same artifact, just includes data. Right, then you have the import-export service, and this is talking REST calls, right? And we'll see actually how this is done in a minute, right? So if you're taking your database and you want to get it to the cloud, you can either just do a one-time deploy to SQL Azure, or you can push that to Windows Azure Blob Storage, and then use the import-export service to push that or import that into SQL Azure or to multiple databases. Simple as that, right? And everything's in the cloud. So you've got these same client libraries, the same DAC services, the DAC framework that's running in the cloud. Okay, that's how it works. You got the client libraries on premises, and you have the same client libraries in the cloud. Okay, and this is why, we'll get to this in a minute, this is why you may need to install additional client libraries on premises if you're running an earlier version of SQL Server, because the cloud service, the import-export service, is running the SQL Server 2012 version of the client libraries. So if you want to take and back up your database and you've got an earlier version, if you're running 2008 R2 and you want to back up a database, you need to install the SQL Server 2012 components to be able to import that and use the import-export service. Does that make sense? Okay, and we'll actually see those. We'll list those and actually show you those, okay? Any questions so far? Okay, pretty simple. Okay, some of the benefits, right? What's awesome about this is you can actually turn some of these things and do an automated deployment, right? So instead of just going one at a time, we can make this and automate your deployment, like I talked about earlier about your software development lifecycle. If you want to push some of your changes up there, you can use the backpack services to push your changes to Windows Azure SQL Database, right, through a backpack. Like we said, the import-export service integrated right in the portal. We'll show you that in a demo. What's awesome about this is I like these last three bullet points here. Has anybody ever tried to build in retry logic into an application? Yeah? One guy said yes. How easy was that? What's that? Not bad? Well, we should hire you. So it's really not that, it's pretty difficult. If you want to do connection resiliency and retry logic, it can be fairly difficult, right? Depending on, I guess, how complex you want to make it. What's great about this is that inside the DAC framework and the import-export service is built-in retry. So if the connection drops, it'll wait and continue to retry until the connection picks back up and then continue, okay? What's also awesome is using in the import-export service and the DAC client libraries is you can do what's called a selective export. So instead of saying, give me the entire database, I can filter that export down to say, just give me these records or these tables or these columns and selectively export just the data I want, not the entire database, okay? And then lastly, the progressive status reporting. We're actually going to see a demo of this because we've got a simple one and then a more complex one, right? Because I just don't want to see a green status bar going across. I want to see what's going on, okay? And we'll actually see this in a demo. All right, now let's get into the requirements. Okay, so for on-premises, you need SQL Server 2012 or SQL Server 2014. All the components are installed. If you are talking if you have SQL Server 2008 R2 and earlier, I just talked about this, you don't need to install these additional client libraries if you're not going to migrate to SQL Azure. Like if you want to just create a backpack and then install it on another local database, you don't need these. You only need to install these additional client libraries if you're planning on taking your backpack and using the import-export service to import that database into SQL Azure. Because they need to talk the same version of the DAC framework. Make sense? Okay. All right. Now, as great as this message sounds, there are a few limitations. Okay? Like the SQL Variant Data Type. Anybody using that? SQL Variant Data Type? Good. Good. So no SQL Variant Data Type, no transactional consistency. We'll come back to that because there is. It just depends on how you're doing it, right? We will actually come back to this in a later demo. The source DB must be Windows Azure SQL Database compatible. We'll show you how to make that compatible. Secrets not migrated, meaning passwords, users, logins, those are not migrated. Right? Just tables, store procedures, all the, things like that. Anybody here running SQL Server 2000? Anybody here afraid to admit that they're running SQL Server 2000? Yeah, thank you. Okay, yeah. I'm not raising my hand. You raise your hand. Yeah. Okay, well, let's get that one. Yeah, we're running it, but I'm not telling you I'm running it. Okay. Transactional consistency. Let's come back to that. By default, the import-export service or the backpack is not transactionally consistent. And I'm talking about if you're you've got a Windows Azure SQL database or SQL Azure database, right? And you want to back that up, right? By default, when you do an an export or a backup, that is not transactionally consistent. So how do you get a transactionally consistent backup? How do you create a database in SQL Azure? Through the command prompt. What's the syntax? Yeah, create database name. Right? How do you make a copy of that database? Create database name, as copy of source database name, right? That syntax right there, that command creates a transactionally consistent backup, copy of your database, okay? So if I say create database as copy of source data, create database 2 as copy 1, right? That when it's all done, that new database will be transactionally consistent. So during the copy process, I could be uploading gigabytes of data into the source database. By the time that copy's done or the upload's done, both will be the same, right? So if I want to back up, and I'll show you this in a demo, if I want to back up, I have a transaction consistent backup, I just do a copy, use the new database as my source for the backpack, and then delete the copy. Okay? And I'll show you, we actually implemented this in the portal to do this automatically for you. Okay? So, with that, let's jump out and do some demos. All right? So let me open got the SQL Server Management portal open here. And so what I've done is I've got several servers. These are all my servers. Right? Even as an employee, I can only have 6 servers. I don't know why. Microsoft can only have 6 servers, but this is my North Europe. And I have no databases on here, but what I want to show you real quick, let me go to a server that's got some databases. Where's my West US? And if I go to database, let's just pick the AdventureWorks database. If I go to configure, right? Yeah, I can do automatic. If I click on automatic, and this is new, if I click on automatic, I can actually back up to a storage account and schedule a transactionally consistent backup. So I can automatically back up my database on a scheduled basis, right? And it goes to blob storage. Were you guys aware of this? This is awesome. So this is my automatic backup in the cloud, okay? And this is transactionally consistent. So what it does is it creates a copy, uses that copy to create my backpack, then deletes the copy. What's the downside to that? I am now paying for that copy, for the existence of, so it may exist for 5 minutes, but I'm paying for the existence of that copy for 5 minutes, right? So the little downside. All right, let's turn that off. All right, so let me show you, so the backpack. I've got SQL Server 2012, right? Here's my on-premises database, and here server, and then I've got my cloud server, right? So there's my two servers. There's my on-premises, and there's my my cloud, right? So we're going to let's start simple, right? So let's take this Contoso expense database, and we make it very simple for you. Deploy database to SQL Azure. We cannot make it any easier for you, okay? But what it is this is just a one-time shot. What it does is it says, okay, deploy, connect, and notice there it creates a .backpack, right? .backpack. So it's going to contain schema and data. I just connect to SQL Azure, and say next, finish, and it creates a backpack, deploys that to the database. I don't have to pre-create the database. It just goes, creates a database, migrates my data and my schema, all done. But it does not keep that backpack around. So if I just want a one-time shot migration, there we go. Okay. However, what if I want to keep that artifact around, that backpack? Or what if I want to use that to deploy to multiple databases? Well, then we have this one. Okay, tasks, extract, is it this one? Is it extract? No, I always get this wrong. It is export data tier application. And notice it's the same thing, right? I can say it's a backpack, so same backpack, but I have two options here. I can deploy this, I can save this backpack to local disk, or I can save this to our Windows Azure blob storage. And then once it's in blob storage, I can then go to the, let's go back here. There's my Windows Azure import-export service, okay, built into the portal. So once I deploy here to blob storage, I can then use the import-export service to say, all right, pull this from my blob storage into a new database, okay? But what I want to show you here first is the ability to say, I'm just going to save this to a local disk, okay? And I'm just going to save it, to call this, we'll call this Contoso.backpack, okay? Next, and finish. But what we get here is a simple, just a very, hey, extracting schema from database, and processing. Doesn't give me a whole lot. It doesn't tell me how long it's got, right? It's just, hey, I'm all done. And not a very big database, but just says, hey, I'm all done, okay? Now I could take this and go back to SQL Azure. So I'm going to now go right mouse click on my SQL Azure server and say, import data tier application. Grab that. Next. Okay, and here's the important part. So notice that it's going to create a database name called Contoso because it took that from the backpack name, but it's going to create a database of 1 gigabyte web edition database. Okay, this you have a little homework to do because you need to pick the appropriate database size. Because if I exported a 10 gig database, but tried to import it into a 1 gigabyte web edition database, it's going to throw up all over itself, right? So make sure that you pick the right database size that you're going to import into, right? This is only about 10 megs, so this is going to be fine. And notice here, I'm going to get really what we got in the export, I'm going to get in the import, but just the reverse. So creating database, target on database. So now if I go back down here, let's refresh that. There's Contoso, okay? There we go. Very simple migration. It should only take a couple minutes or not even that long, right? But that's migration. But it really didn't tell us that much, right? It just said processing table, processing table, processing table. So, so from a migration standpoint, is this all right? I'd like a little more information, wouldn't you? Okay, so how do we get more information out of this? So there we go, we're almost done. Okay, so now the next part, now we're going to get a little more tricky because now, and I also may want more granular control over when and how my database is migrated. Okay, so we're all done. There's my database. But I may want more control out of that. Okay, I may want to say what's migrated, when it's migrated. I want to say the status and things like that. So this is where we're going to crack open Visual Studio and get more information. So what we're going to do is, I got DAFX example. So what I've done here in Visual Studio is I created a sample console project. Okay, and what I did is in my references here, I made a reference to the same client library that SQL Server Management Studio uses. Same DLL. Okay? And then I just made a reference to that here. And all I'm doing here is I'm saying when this starts up, I'm going to ask it a few questions. I'm going to ask it, what's the target connection string of where my source database is? What do I want? What's my source database name? What's my target database name? And what's the file path of the backpack that I want it to create? And then all I'm doing in here is I'm just a few lines of code. I'm saying create a new DAX service. This is the exact same thing SQL Server Management Studio uses. Okay, so create a new DAX service, one line of code to export, and another line of code to import. Ta-da! Okay, so let's run this really fast. Let me grab my connection string. So let me run this. So let me paste my connection string, edit, paste. I want to export Contoso expense. I'm going to call this new. So it's going to export, just to make it simple and not wait, I'm going to export and import back into on-premises, okay? So we'll call this Contoso expense 3, and let's save that to :/temp /Contoso expense 3.backpack. Okay, so if we run this, we actually don't get much more than what we got. Actually, we don't get anything, right? So how do we know that that backpack's actually working, right? Well, we can do this. We can go, okay, well, let's jump over here and go to temp. Do I have a CS3, CE3? Oh, look, there it is, right? Okay, it's done. It took about 17 seconds. Okay, so I should be able to go over here, refresh. There's CE3. So about 17 seconds to export and then import. If I were going to SQL Azure, it would probably take a few more seconds, maybe about 20 seconds, right? But the downside is I didn't get squat for information, right? I want more information. Well, luckily, and I don't know why the SQL Server Management Studio doesn't do this, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back in here and add a few code snippets, right? So I'm going to say Control X, event handlers, right? And then I'm going to go down here. Okay, and I need to fix a few things. This should be v progress event. Okay, so just by adding a few lines of code, let's run this again and see what kind of information we get. Okay, so because I need to grab that again. Let's run this one more time. Edit, paste. I'm going to do Contoso expense again. Yep, also expense. Call this CE4 /temp /CE backpack. Okay, you ready? How much information am I going to get back if it works? Much, much more information, because see it says 4.7, it's just going to keep going. Isn't that much better information than just processing table, processing table, processing table, processing table? This only took 12 seconds too. And what's even better is that I could actually pipe this out to a text file to evaluate, and to save that, to see what was going on. This is the kind of information I want when I'm importing and exporting. So what I could have done is said import this to SQL Azure, things like that, right? So from a very simple example, this is a great way to get better feedback from a migration standpoint. What's going on, right? So now I can get better, more granular control over when the backpack is, so I can actually schedule this if I want to, and be able to schedule and more granular control over my migration, right? But let's look at another example first, because this was the on-prem. How do I then? But what's on the other side? How do I get more control over the import-export service? Right? I may want to take my database and go from on-prem to SQL Azure, but I may want more control over how I'm importing into using the import-export service. So let's refresh this. There's number 4. All right. So what we have here is another project called import-export service. And what we've done is we have basically taken and created a web service and hosted those web services in all 8 of our Windows Azure data centers. Okay? These web services are available for you to use at any time, and these are web services expose the import-export service. Right? So if you want more granular control, if you want more flexibility over how, not just the 2 buttons in the portal, you basically just grab one of these services and do for example, just add a service reference. Okay? So this is the one for West US, right? And all it's doing is saying, there's my web service. And at that point, I have access to the entire client libraries for the import-export service, right? And at that point, I can do something like this. And I'm not going to run this, but this is just an example of, I can now do web requests to import and export my databases. So what I can do now is an end-to-end scenario where I export, hand this off to the import-export service programmatically, and import that into Windows Azure SQL database. Okay? And because I now have better and more granular control over how it's exported or imported, or vice versa, from on-premises to SQL Azure and vice versa, I can now schedule these things to take maybe my updates and apply those to SQL Azure, or manually or programmatically back up my databases in Windows Azure SQL database. Does that make sense? I'm not going to run this because this is a lot of code to go through, but what this does is basically I get the same feedback here because it uses the same libraries. I get the same feedback here about the progress updates and the progress status messages, 10%, 20%, 30%, okay? Now, I know this is, I don't mean to bore you with C# code, right? But this is important because now you say, instead of just cracking open SQL Server Management Studio and right mouse click deploy or right mouse click export, now I get more control over when and how these are done, right? So any questions about this so far? Yeah?
You're going to integrate that into the studio?
Into SQL Server Management Studio? I've already sent that email. You mean as far as feedback? Yeah, I've already sent that email going, this is what we need, right? Yeah, script it out. Yeah, it would be. I've already said we need to see this kind of feedback, right? So now what I want to do is show you. Okay, let's try to take the AdventureWorks database and do the same thing. Okay, so tasks. We're just going to export data to application. We'll call this aw.backpack. Okay, is this going to succeed or is this going to fail miserably? Who says succeed? Who says fail miserably? All your hands should go up. Come on, all your hands should go up. This should fail miserably. Okay, let's try and let's figure out why. Come on. Okay, so it erred. It didn't even get to export. It erred, failed miserably. All right, so how do we find out why? Let's just click one of these errors. Okay. So, let's see. How many errors do you think there are here? A lot. I think somewhere in here it says that I think it says there's almost close to 2,000 errors in this database. Okay? So, how do we go about fixing this and getting it ready for migration? Because, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because if you have databases where you actually try to do this in errors, how do you fix it? And how do you go find out what happened? Right? And how do you address it? So I think there's close to 2,000 errors here. Okay? So let's jump back to the slides and let's talk now about the SQL Server data tools. Okay? From a migration standpoint, we just talked about the DAC framework and the import-export service. This makes it fairly easy if you want to get started fairly quickly and just take my database and go, right? The key here is if my database has issues, things aren't supported in SQL Azure that are supported in on-prem, how do you fix this stuff? So this is where the SQL Server data tools comes in. Who's familiar with the SQL Server data tools? Okay, a couple of you. It comes with as an add-on to SQL Server 2010, but it comes installed automatically with with Visual Studio 2012 and 2013. Automatically, okay? And what it is, it's just a declarative model-based development integrated right into Visual Studio. Has support for SQL Server if you're familiar with it. So it's almost just like working in SQL Server or SQL Server Management Studio. The difference is now you're working with a database project, right? So support for SQL Server and SQL database support does change detection. I can script out my database and then work with that offline and then reconnect and deploy my changes, things like that. It's actually a pretty nice tool. The key benefits are, number one, is to prepare my database for migration to SQL Azure. That's number one. How do I take this AdventureWorks database and get this ready in a matter of minutes? Like there's almost 2,000 errors. Could I do that in a half an hour, one at a time? No, absolutely not, right? So how do I fix these automatically, right? It allows me to do schema deployment, project-based development, and connected development, right? So I can work in a connected or disconnected state. But the key here is I can use this as part of my software development lifecycle to make changes and then deploy, right? And then get my database ready for Windows Azure SQL Database, okay? So 2 slides, and then let's jump back into a demo. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to close these 2 projects because I don't need them. Close. And I'm going to open a new, SQL Server Data Tools. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to connect. I should be able to connect to. Let me just do it this way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect to my on-premises, and databases, and I'm going to say create a new project based on this AdventureWorks database. Okay, and I'm going to call this project just database 1. Just as an example, I'm going to click start. Okay. So as this goes, it's going to create a project now, interrogate my database, and create a database project based on the settings it finds. It won't take that long. It takes about just a few seconds. Okay. It says step on, right? So it's done. Didn't take that long. So now I've got my solution over here. Okay. And my project property says this is SQL Server 2012. So if I were to compile this, right, it should say, yep, ready to go. Build out succeeded. However, I can change this to Windows Azure SQL Database. Okay, let me save that. What happens if I rebuild? Bam! Just threw up all over itself again. Okay, so I can go through and notice it only has 201 errors. That's because I think this error box only holds 201 errors. Right? But I know that there's at least almost 2,000 errors, right? So how do I fix this? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this again. Okay? So I'm going to create another one. And I'm going to fix all those 2,000 errors in about 5 minutes. Okay? About 5 minutes. And that's while talking. Okay? So let's do this again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this up. I'm going to do a new database project. So create a new database project. Call this number 2. Actually, we'll call this, we'll call this database 2. So we're going to do the same thing here. Should only take a couple seconds. Done. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here and I'm going to add a new project. I'm going to add an empty, where's my database projects? Just a SQL Server project. I'm going to call this AW Cloud. Okay, so there's my AW Cloud, and I'm going to set this the properties to this, to Windows Azure SQL Database. Okay, now how do I fix these errors? This is actually pretty cool. Who knew? Anybody know that there was a SQL comparison in SQL Server Data Tools? Awesome. The rest of you, okay, this is really cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a comparison. I'm going to select my I want to do that one. Yep. And what I want to compare this to is an empty project. Okay. So I'm comparing the AdventureWorks database itself, to an empty project. So how do I fix most of these errors? I'm going to go to Properties, Object Type, and what I'm going to do is in here is I'm going to deselect all of these. Let's do this. Well, let's make this a little smaller. Hold on. So I want to see the list. Okay, so simple. Just go through and so as I'm going through this, why am I unselecting these? Well, yeah, obviously they're not supported in SQL Azure. Why aren't they supported? So we're going to start aggregates. I am Microsoft, so I'll tell you the answer in a minute. Okay. Assemblies, asymmetric keys. Your job is to make sure I don't miss one. Broker properties, certificates, contracts, defaults, extended. Okay, this one right here will clear up most of those errors. Just unchecking that one extended properties box will probably clear, at least fix most of those errors. Okay, extended properties, file groups, file table, full text, then message types, partition schemes and functions, queues, service bindings, rules, sequences, services, symmetric keys, or symmetric keys. Symmetric keys, user-defined CLR, and XML indexes. There we go. Done. So why aren't those supported? If you think about Windows Azure SQL Database and on-prem SQL Server, a lot of these things have to do with the overall, either they're server-based components of SQL Server, or they have to do with OS level stuff, right? And in Windows Azure SQL Database, sorry, let me phrase that. So instance level or box level components, right? If you look at all of these, you don't have access to the box. You don't have access to the instance, right? So things like, and right now, XML, like XML schemas, XML indexes, things like that. Full text search isn't there yet, right? Encryption's not there. So a lot of these things have to do with either instance level things or server level components, right? And since you don't have access to the box of their instance, we can't give you that, right? Things like, encryption's not supported because encryption is based on a certificate, correct? Right? Certificates are server level certificates. So if my database is on the same server as your database and we use different levels of encryption, how do we solve that? Right? So there's just things that aren't supported because, one, we don't know how to solve them yet, or just, they don't need to be supported, right now. Things like that. All right. So now that I've got that going, let's do our comparison. Okay. I'm probably past my 5 minutes already, aren't I? That's all right. All right, this shouldn't take that long. All right, there we go. And then let's update. So let's update. Yep, we want to update the target. The update won't take that long. Okay, done. We don't need this, so we can get rid of that. So there's our database, done. So now if I compile this, is it going to compile successfully? No, there's still going to be a few errors, okay, and still over 201. However, things like row good call. So row good call is not supported, so what we're going to do is we're going to go to Control H and replace with nothing. Where's replace all? Replace all. No, you want to do replace all in the entire row good call and edit, find and replace in files, and replace all. Yes. So 88 occurrences of that. Okay, done. We'll save. What's the next error list? Not for replication. Whoops. Where's not for replication? So we're going to take not for replication. And why isn't replication started? Because we don't replicate one database doesn't know where the other database is. So we're going to do the same thing there. Edit, find and replace in files. We're going to do the same thing. Replace that with nothing. Done. 16 occurrences fixed there. Save all. And lastly, this we have to do manually, right? We just got to take these out. The XML data type is supported, right? It's just these schema collections are not supported, right? So we're going to take that one out. Okay. Next one. I'm going to fix these real quick. Okay, save that one. Save that one. And take a couple more. Okay, and one more. Oh, done. Let's compile this again. I'm going to get two more errors I should get. Actually, yep. And that's because every table must have, so just for practices, just to get this done, every table must have a clustered index. So let's fix this one. Okay, rebuild. Succeeded. So in about 5 to 10 minutes, I just took a database that has almost nearly 2,000 errors and made it ready for migration to Windows Azure SQL Database. Okay, and my friend in all of that was the SQL Server data tools and the ability to do a schema compare. Okay, so at this point, what I could do is now deploy this into there's no data in here. So to get this into SQL Azure now, my next step is to deploy this back to on-premise into a new database, export disable the indexes, migrate the data, re-enable the indexes, and then just do a backpack. Right? So in about 10 to 15 minutes, I could go from start to finish, getting my database from on-premises to Windows Azure SQL Database. Okay, so is that all right? So this for me is the tool that you need to use for if you're doing a migration processes and things like that. How do I get my database ready? Now, let's with the few minutes we have left, right? Let's jump into some of the other tools. Okay, so other tools. We got some Microsoft tools and some third-party tools from our migration. Has anybody used any of these from our right? Okay, so the Generate Scripts Wizard, you guys know and love this? All right, if you want to migrate to your database, this is not the tool to use, okay? Unless, and I'll show you why, okay? Because if you have a fairly large database, even if you try to do the AdventureWorks database, right, and did schema, so let's take this and go tasks, generate scripts, next, right? Let's just do tables next. It does give you the ability in the advanced dialog to do SQL Azure. Do you guys know that? Okay. So it does do that. The reason I wouldn't recommend this, and it does a fairly decent job, but the problem with this is that even if you have, if you got a database of a somewhat decent size, your script is going to be huge, right? To the point where it may not even open in SQL Server Management Studio. Okay? So that causes a problem in that you could probably just use this to do schema and then use some other tool to do your data. But that's, to me, too much work, right? Why should I have to use 2 tools to get my database, right? What I tell people is script your database for, if you want to know what's supported and what's not supported, script this for SQL Server 2012, for example, and pick like previous. Pick not all the tables, but pick maybe one table and one store procedure, script that, and then try to run that against SQL Azure and see what kind of errors you get. But from a migration standpoint, this causes a challenge because if you're doing schema and data, your script could be too large, right? To the point where if it's like 100 or 200 meg, it won't even open in SQL Server Management Studio, right? So then you have to just do the schema and run your schema script, and then use something like BCP to get your data over, right? And then who likes to learn? Anybody here love learning BCP? Nobody? Oh, see, I'm the same way. I hate B. It's awesome, but it could be a challenge, right? So, Generic Scripts Wizard, right? It's okay. BCP, The problem with BCP is that your database must first exist in the target. So you got to go create it and then run it. Okay? Where the backpack, all these import-export utilities and the DAC, they'll create your database for you. Beautiful. Right? Even the SQL Server data tools will create your database for you. Okay? So, Generate Scripts Wizard, kind of lengthy, right? Can be a hassle. BCP can be cumbersome to use, right? And learning that. SSIS, anybody SSIS fans here? Okay? Just one, two? Three? Come on, you guys are who's here afraid of raising your hand? I think a lot of, okay. So, SSIS, this is great as well, except same thing. Your database, your target database must exist first, because you have to map it, source to target and all that kind of stuff, right? And if there's any conversions, this does a great way of, if you're doing anything like need to convert some of your data or do data conversions or transformations, this is a great way to do that while you're migrating. However, it can take a while. If you've got a large database, this can take a while. SSIS could take a while. BCP is actually really, really, really fast. If you want to figure out BCP, it actually works really quick, okay? The migration assistants. Anybody here familiar with the migration assistants? These are Microsoft-supported utilities on MSDN that will help you migrate your database from, your database could be SQL Server, it could be Oracle, could be DB2, could be MySQL. They're little assistants that will migrate Oracle or any of these, or even at Microsoft Access to SQL Azure. Okay, and these are supported by Microsoft because they're on MSDN. They were created by Microsoft for migration from other platforms to SQL Azure. Okay, they're awesome. If you want to migrate, these are a great way because it'll go through and say, hey, what's supported, what's not, things like that. Okay, the SQL Database Migration Wizard. This is you'll find this on Codeplex. Was created by a Microsoft employee, but is not supported by Microsoft. And really what it is a combination of the Generate Scripts Wizard and BCP. All I did was put a UI on top of Generate Scripts and BCP. So what it does is it'll generate generate your schema, BCP out your data, and then run your script, and then be BCP in your data, right? So, take your pick, okay? So, some of the best practice. So, from a utility standpoint, if you're familiar with some of these might be a great way to figure out what's supported, what's not, or might be a great way to get your database into SQL Azure, right? But we talked about SQL Server data tools, we talked about the client libraries and the DAC because these are the recommended ways to migrate, okay? All right, some best practices really quick. Things to keep in mind, right? Data types, what's supported and what's not supported, right? So you got to go through and say, if you try to, like we did with the AdventureWorks database, if you right mouse click and do export and it blows up, got to go figure out why. Most of the data types are supported, but like SQL Variant, it's not supported, okay? But most people don't use that, but you might have to understand what your data types are and what's supported and what's not. Data size, okay? Why would I do, let's jump out here and do this. Why would I do let me cancel that. Why would I do a, where'd it go? Why would I do a deploy database versus a export data tier application? Why would I do one over the other? Deploy is a one-time shot, right? So if I want to just get my database into SQL Azure, I'm done, right? If I want to keep that artifact around and import it, but what about size? What does database size have to do with this? Okay, so if I do an export data tier application, okay, if I say tasks, export data tier application, right? To me, personally, and sort of best practices, the size of the database to me will depend on, do I save this to local disk or do I push this to Azure Blob Storage? Okay, why would I do that? Well, if I've got a fairly large database, we're talking, gigs of size, do I want to keep, if I want to publish that to SQL Azure to multiple places, do I want to keep pushing that over the wire? No, I don't. Let me push that. So let me save that to Windows Azure and then import that multiple times where my response, my performance is going to be much better. So the size of the database matters depending on how I'm going to deploy in my deployment process to SQL Azure. Like the Contoso expense was maybe not even, 1 meg. It was really tiny, right? So I could push that out. But if I have a database that's fairly large, 10, 20, 30 gig, I don't want to save that locally. Let me save that to Windows Azure one time. Let me go over the wire one time to blob storage, and then I can use the import-export service multiple times where my performance is going to be so much faster because I don't have that latency of going across the internet, right? So for me, the data size matters, right? And it also determines on, what tools do I use as well. Like if I have a 30 gig database, I am not using the Generate Scripts wizard. Just not happening. And I may not even use BCP, right? Some of these tools, so data size. Frequency also, how often are you backing up? How often are you migrating? How often are you publishing updates to your database, right? They'll have to keep that in mind as well. Transactional consistency, we talked about this, right? Your databases are on premises are transactionally consistent, but if you're taking your database from SQL Azure to on premises, right? Do you want that transactionally consistent? And how do you make that transactionally consistent? You got to make a copy, right? Or go into the portal and turn on the automatic, right? But if so you have choices. Does transactionally consistent databases matter to you? Just a question you have to ask yourself, right? And then lastly, technology proficiency. What are you good at? Do you want to learn BCP? Do you want to learn SSIS? Or do you like the GUI and like the right mouse click go? I'm the right mouse click guy, right? I don't want to type as much more than I have to, so I prefer right mouse click and publish. Okay, so lastly, here's a chart. This will be available. In fact, I think these slides will be available. But basically, what it does is the ability to say, it just says, what the tool is. Does it do schema? Does it do data? Does it have data transfer efficiency? Is it transactionally consistent? Things like that. So a quick chart comparison onto what's available and what's not, and how you can use these tools. And lastly, what I want to do is in SQL Server 2012 and SQL Server 2014, I don't think I have the script here. It comes with SQL Server 2014, but in SQL Server 2012, SP2 CU 1000 or something like that, whatever CU it is, right? You do have the ability through T-SQL to do backup database right to blob storage to T-SQL, through T-SQL. So I can say backup database, call this Contoso expense, and then and then pass it P, and the URL. Let's do west. Come on. Let's call it backpacks. CE 5.backpack. I don't have the latest CU, but in 2012 and 2014, I can do that. Right, so this is actually a nice way from a migration standpoint. Instead of doing right mouse click backpack, bam, done. Right up to blob storage, and then use the import export service. Right, this does require it does require you set up credentials. Right, so define credentials. Credential. Right? Define credential, and the credentials are your username and password to your Windows Azure storage account, and then just backup database. So from a migration process to get your database, you can actually do this in 2014 or one of the later CUs for 2012. Okay? All right. Any questions so far? Yeah.
Why don't you support contained databases? That was the first thing I tried. I mean, I put users in the database and I tried to export the contained database to Azure, and I think that was
Yeah, I have. I'll answer that offline because I can't remember. I do have an answer for that, but I have to look it up. But there's a good reason for that. So I can't remember the answer, but I do have that. So I'll look that up. So we're out of time. We got a few minutes left actually. But any questions? Was this yeah?
If we wanted to export on a regular basis, but we have only a subset of data, what's the best process?
Export on a regular basis, but only a subset of data.
Yeah, so skip all the historical because it's not relevant.
Right. So, but export from on-premises. Yeah, that's that selective export. Where'd it go? So you can do a selective export and say only export this data, right? So in that, and I think we may have a sample of that on our MSDN code samples page. I think there's a couple export examples, and one of those I think shows you how to do but it's the same thing. You're just basically using that same client library, but defining in that what data you want to export, right? But it's the selective export. You're saying, let me export these tables or these rows. Basically, what you're doing is you're applying a filter to the data to say only export this data, right? So, which is awesome. I love that because now you're saying if I've got a 100 gig database, but I only want to say maybe I've got a database and I want to export my European data to restore in Europe. I don't have to take the entire database. I can just say, give me my European data and restore that over there, right? Make sense? So I'll see if I can find where that's at. Okay. All right. Anything else? Any other questions? Was this helpful? Yeah? Okay. So if you have any more questions or want to talk more, you have my contact information. But anyway, thanks for coming. Appreciate it.